I was 16 the first time my parents left me alone for an entire weekend. They had a long-planned getaway at a lakeside lodge, and they insisted this would be an important step toward my independence. Our neighborhood was usually quiet, wide streets lined with maple trees, neatly trimmed lawns, and houses spaced just far enough apart that you never quite felt crowded. I had never felt uneasy in our single-story ranch home. I knew every squeak of its floors, every soft hum of its HVAC system, and how the wind rattled the storm windows on blustery nights. When my parents drove away on Friday afternoon, I stood in the driveway and watched their car until it turned the corner. The early autumn sunlight gave the neighborhood a warm glow, and leaves drifted lazily from the trees. I felt a momentary pang of loneliness, but I reminded myself that this was normal. Being alone at 16 was hardly abnormal. I had a comfortable plan for the evening. I would heat up a frozen dinner, watch some old thriller movies, and then head to bed early. All the doors were locked, the windows secured. We owned a small bulldog named Winston, who rarely barked, but I still found comfort in the soft clack of his nails on the hardwood. Once everything was settled, I felt prepared for a calm night. At around 11 o'clock that night, while I was half dozing through the second movie, Winston lifted his head from the rug and stared down the hallway. At first, I saw nothing there, so I assumed he had simply heard a car outside. But he stood up, ears angled forward, and then he moved into the hallway at a slow, deliberate pace. Something about his behavior felt off. He was typically too lazy to investigate small noises. Yet here he was, steadily advancing toward the dark corridor that led to my parents' bedroom and, more importantly, the attic hatch overhead. The attic in our house wasn't a place we used often. It was an unfinished space above the hallway, accessible only by a small hatch in the ceiling. There was a rickety metal latch to keep it shut. As Winston gazed upward, I noticed the hatch looked the same as always. Just a flat piece of plywood flush with the ceiling, no visible gap or opening. I tried calling Winston back. When he refused to come, I walked over and nudged him gently, then tapped on the hatch with my knuckle. Nothing happened. No sounds, no movement. Eventually, Winston backed away, so I flipped on the hallway light to confirm everything was normal. The hatch was secure. After convincing myself nothing was amiss, I guided Winston back to the living room. He curled up on the rug, and I switched off the hallway light, feeling a bit uneasy, but certain it was just the old house settling. When I finally went to bed at midnight, Winston trotted behind me. I turned off all the lights except for a small lamp in my room. He settled on the foot of my bed, and we both dozed off. Some hours later, a noise roused me from an uneasy sleep. I couldn't identify it at first, somewhere between a scrape and a soft thump. I sat up, heart pounding, and realized it was coming from above the ceiling. The attic. I listened intently. The sound repeated, a shuffling noise, as though a large cardboard box was being moved inch by inch. Every few seconds, it would pause, and then start again. Winston was awake too. His head lifted, ears perked, clearly hearing the same thing. I tried to maintain composure, telling myself it was just a rodent or a raccoon that had gotten inside. Yet the pace of the scraping seemed too measured, almost purposeful. I got out of bed, eased my way into the hallway, and switched on the light. The second I did, the sound halted. Silence pressed down on me. I stared at the attic hatch, noticing the metal latch was still in place. I waited several moments, but nothing else came. Eventually, I returned to my bedroom, but it took me a long time to fall asleep again. The following day, the house was peaceful. No odd noises, no signs of disturbed belongings. I spent the afternoon checking every window and door, ensuring I hadn't overlooked anything. I went so far as to open the basement door to confirm it was locked from the inside. Then I took Winston on a walk around the block, trying to dispel the lingering tension. By evening, I almost convinced myself that the noises had been a product of my imagination. But once darkness fell, that sense of quiet foreboding returned. Winston seemed restless, pacing around rather than curling up in his usual spot. Around midnight, I forced myself to stay awake a while longer, reading on the living room couch with all the lights on. The house remained still. Eventually, I convinced myself to turn off the lights and head to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke to a sharp metallic clang reverberating from the hallway. Winston was already off the bed, growling at the door. My pulse raced. I grabbed my phone and crept into the hall, flicking the switch. The overhead light buzzed to life, illuminating every corner. And then I saw it. The attic hatch was slightly ajar, maybe an inch, and the metal latch dangled open. A cold wave of dread coursed through me. Something had unlocked the hatch from the inside. My mind raced through rational explanations. Perhaps the latch was old and loose, or the vibration from a passing truck had jarred it open. But those explanations felt hollow at that moment, especially with the memory of that scraping noise fresh in my mind. The attic opening gaped like a silent invitation. I hesitated at the threshold, phone in one hand. I debated calling the police. Yet there was no definite sign of an intruder, just an open hatch. Fear battled with the impulse to find real proof. I took one step forward, then another, until I stood under the hatch. I raised my phone's flashlight and shone it into the dark space above. The beam revealed dusty rafters, insulation, and the outlines of a few old boxes. Nothing moved. No eyes peered back at me. I listened, but no rustling came. My own breathing was the loudest sound. After a few seconds, I slid the hatch shut, fastened the latch, and stepped back. Instead of returning to my room, I locked myself in the guest bedroom at the far end of the house. Winston followed, trembling slightly. I barely slept. Morning light brought me a surge of courage. I phoned a friend who lived a few streets over and asked if he could help me check the attic. He came by, and together we climbed a stepladder in the hallway, unlatched the hatch, and pushed it aside. With two flashlights aimed into the gloom, we climbed up into the cramped space. The attic floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. We saw a few footprints that might have been ours from a time long ago. Summer cleaning or storing seasonal items, but nothing fresh. The old boxes were lined neatly against the sides, each containing old quilts and clothing. There was no rodent droppings or raccoon nest, no sign of forced entry. Every vent and small window was locked from the inside, with no damage. Everything appeared undisturbed. Unable to find anything concrete, we closed the hatch again. My friend left, clearly perplexed by my story. I paced the hallway for a while, trying to rationalize the events. The scraping at night, the open latch, Winston's unusual behavior. If a person had been there, how had they left no trace? If it was an animal, how could it manipulate the latch? My parents returned late that afternoon. I told them what happened, and they seemed concerned, but not entirely convinced there was a real threat. My father inspected the attic himself, confirming what I already knew. There was nothing to see. He added a second latch to secure the hatch, and then we all had dinner together, as though it were just an ordinary evening. I tried to settle back into my normal life, but my perception of the house shifted in a permanent way. Even though the noises stopped after that weekend, I never felt fully comfortable again, under that stretch of attic ceiling. Sometimes late at night, I would think I heard a faint tapping sound, barely audible, as though something was testing its boundaries. I never discovered what, if anything, was in that attic. All that remains is the disquieting reminder that something might have roamed above my head, aware of my presence, curious enough to open a latch. The unknown nature of it, whether it was animal, human, or something else entirely, lingers with me whenever I find myself alone in the house. The attic hatch, with its new latch, sits overhead like a sealed secret, a silent testament to an encounter I still cannot fully explain. I grew up in a 2-story house built in the 1940s, complete with old heating ducts that snaked through the walls and floors. My parents traveled frequently for work, and on one particular weekend, they left me alone for 2 nights. The house was spacious, with creaking floorboards, tall windows, and a half-finished basement that was perpetually cold. Normally, I found comfort in its old-world charm. It felt like home, full of warm memories and the subtle hum of the furnace. That Friday night, I finished my dinner around 9 p.m., tidied the kitchen, and then prepared to relax in the living room. My cat, Miso, perched on the windowsill, flicking her tail at shadows. The wind outside was calm, so the usual rattling of branches against the window was absent. Everything felt stable and quiet. But just as I sat down to watch a movie, a faint sound drifted through one of the floor vents. It was a murmur, almost too low to register as a voice. At first, I assumed it was the television or my phone, but the volume on both was off. I paused, turning my head to focus on that slight, airy noise. It came again, like someone whispering from far below, somewhere in the heating ducts that ran down into the basement. Unnerved, I walked over to the vent. Warm air blew upward, carrying a muted hiss. I listened for a full minute, but the voice, if it had been a voice, did not repeat. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was probably just the furnace cycling, or maybe a draft of air echoing strangely through the old pipes. But the house felt different after that. I noticed Miso had moved from the windowsill to the top of the couch, ears angled toward the vent. Her posture was rigid, as if she too had heard something out of place. Hoping to dispel my nerves, I resumed my evening routine, though I couldn't ignore a creeping unease. At around midnight, I heard it again, a clear series of faint syllables drifting up through the vent in the corner of the living room. This time, I hurried to the basement door, flipping on every light along the way. The door was closed and locked, just as I'd left it. I opened it, calling into the darkness. "Hello?" No reply. My voice echoed slightly down the old wooden stairs. I stood at the top step and flipped on the basement lights. They flickered for a moment before settling into a pale glow. Each step down brought a chill, that damp smell of concrete and old laundry detergent. The furnace stood in the far corner, humming softly, the pilot light casting faint orange reflections on the metal ducts. I stood still, trying to detect any abnormal movement or sound. The basement was empty, just boxes, the washer and dryer, some old furniture. Nothing looked disturbed. Feeling somewhat foolish, I climbed back upstairs, closed the door, and made sure to lock it. Yet my pulse remained elevated, and an uneasy tension settled between my shoulder blades. Something about the whispers I'd heard through the vents felt undeniably human, although I couldn't make out words. I tried to sleep, but my mind replayed the muffled tone again and again. The next day, Saturday, proceeded without incident. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the old hardwood floors in warmth. I fed Miso, checked my phone for updates from my parents, and tried to work on a school assignment. By afternoon, I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. But as dusk fell, my apprehension grew. I made sure every door was locked, every ground floor window secured. Around 10 p.m., I settled onto the couch with a book, determined to maintain a sense of normalcy. Close to midnight, an unmistakable chorus of voices began to resonate through the vents. It wasn't a single voice anymore. It sounded like multiple, overlapping murmurs. They rose and fell in unsettling cadences, sometimes blending into what could have been laughter, then shifting into breathy whispers. My skin prickled. I stood, transfixed by the vent near the TV. Warm air still flowed, but within that gentle current came what resembled a hushed conversation just beyond the metal grate. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. One fragment of sound rose above the rest, as though directed at me, yet I couldn't decipher any words. Fear clutched at me. It felt as though the house itself had become a conduit for something intangible. I debated calling the police, but what would I report? Disembodied voices in the heating ducts? They would write it off as a prank or overactive imagination. Still, the sense of a presence was so strong that I couldn't simply ignore it. Summoning what courage I had, I marched to the basement door again. I switched on the lights, this time announcing loudly that I was coming down. The basement was as still as before, the furnace rumbling. I tested the ductwork, tapping on the pipes to see if anything might scamper away. Nothing. Yet the entire time, I sensed I was not alone. Eventually, I returned upstairs, shaken. The voices subsided after 2 a.m., leaving an unnerving quiet. When I finally lay down, exhausted, I couldn't block out the memory of that overlapping murmur, as though several entities were conferring just below my feet. Sunday morning arrived with bright skies and no new noises. I called an HVAC service, hoping for a quick inspection. They told me no one could come out until the following week. With my parents set to return Sunday evening, I decided to endure one more day alone. Throughout the afternoon, I paced the house, checking and rechecking corners, the basement door, the vents. Miso followed me, tail swishing in agitation, as if she too felt something was off. That final night, the voices returned after dark, softer than before, but still unmistakable. They drifted out from multiple vents, creating a patchwork of hushed chanting. I tried turning up music to drown it out, but in quieter moments, I could still sense that murmur. It felt directed, as if the phenomenon was aware of my presence and waiting to see how I would respond. I barely slept, lying awake on the couch, with Miso curled in my lap. The light stayed on. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps in the basement, but I refused to investigate again. My nerves were too frayed. My parents arrived late Sunday night. I recounted the entire ordeal, though my words felt insufficient to convey the eerie, sentient quality of those voices. They listened carefully, promising to check the basement. My father went downstairs, shining a bright flashlight along every duct, testing for loose connections or cracks. He found none. When the HVAC technician arrived days later, he also reported that the system was in good shape. No blockages, no leaks, no pests. Despite their skepticism, my parents acknowledged that the house occasionally carried strange noises. They assumed it was a quirk of old architecture, perhaps shifting pipes or swirling drafts. But I never accepted that explanation. The memory of that layered, whispering chorus remained too vivid to be a random creak or hiss of wind. Even now, years later, I remember the sensation of being watched, or rather, overheard, by something invisible that inhabited the ductwork. When the nights grow quiet, and I find myself alone in that old living room, I sometimes still sense a subtle hush from the vents, as if waiting for me to lean in and listen. What troubles me most is not knowing what it wanted, or why it chose that weekend to reveal its presence. The voices never formed clear words, yet their urgency and intent seemed beyond mere echoes of metal and air. That silence, pregnant with unspoken meaning, lingers in the depths of my memory far more than any conclusive explanation ever could. My childhood home sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by tall oaks that cast dappled shadows over the driveway. It is a mid-century modern house, airy by day, but full of dark corners at night. When I was 17, my parents went on a 2-week business trip to Europe. They asked me to house sit. I was old enough to handle the responsibility, and since we lived in a safe area, they saw no harm in leaving me alone. For the first few days, the solitude felt liberating. I came and went as I pleased, cooked my own meals, and stayed up late reading. The house was comfortable. I'd lived there my entire life, so I was familiar with every creak and groan the building produced. But on the 5th day, something arrived on our doorstep that changed everything. A small package with no return address lay near the door when I came home from the grocery store. It had my name written in looping script, with no postage or delivery markings. Inside, I found an old Polaroid camera. There was no note, no instruction manual, just a camera that smelled faintly of mothballs. I assumed it was a gift from a relative who collected vintage photography equipment. Setting it aside on the coffee table, I planned to call my aunt or cousin later to see if they had sent it. That evening, I made dinner and tried to put the odd package out of my mind. At around midnight, I lay on the couch watching a documentary, half dozing. Then I heard a faint click from across the room. It sounded like the snap of a camera shutter. My eyes darted to the Polaroid on the coffee table, but it was just sitting there. Perhaps I had imagined it. I muted the TV to listen more closely. The house was silent. After a minute, I turned the television volume back up, trying to dismiss the tension creeping along my neck. The next day, I found an envelope slipped under the front door. Inside was a Polaroid photo showing the exterior of our house at night. The snapshot was taken from the sidewalk, facing the living room window, where I had been sitting the previous evening. My silhouette was visible through the curtain. My stomach tightened with dread. Someone had stood in the dark, photographing me from outside. I raced to the window, scanning the street for anything unusual. The cul-de-sac was empty. Nervous energy coursed through me, and I considered calling my parents, but they were across the world, likely asleep or busy. Instead, I locked all the doors, drew the curtains, and left the house only when necessary. That evening, I sat with the Polaroid camera in my lap, as though having it nearby would prevent its mysterious photographer from taking more pictures. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off around midnight. A sudden sharp click jolted me upright. The Polaroid in my hands was untouched. The sound had come from somewhere deeper in the house. I jumped up, flicking on lights as I moved from room to room. In the hallway leading to the guest bedroom, I caught a faint chemical smell, like the developing fluid from a Polaroid film. The guest bedroom door was ajar, and a fresh photo lay on the bed. It showed me, asleep on the couch just moments earlier, framed from the angle of the corner of the living room. Yet I had been holding the only Polaroid camera I knew of. How had this photo been taken? Fear overwhelmed my senses. I locked the guest bedroom door and retreated to my own room, pushing a chair under the doorknob. Heart racing, I sat on the edge of my bed until dawn, unable to sleep. In the morning, I combed the entire house in search of signs of forced entry. Every window was locked, every door secure. The attic hatch was closed and latched, and the basement was empty save for stacked boxes. Still, someone, or something, had to be taking these photographs. There was no sign of a second Polaroid camera, but that was the only explanation that made sense. Unless the same camera had been moved somehow, without my noticing. Desperate, I called 2 of my friends and asked for help. They came over that afternoon, and we searched every inch of the house. We found nothing out of the ordinary, aside from the unsettling Polaroids I showed them. They seemed deeply disturbed, but had no concrete advice. One friend suggested calling the police, yet we couldn't point to a tangible intruder or break-in. That night, I barricaded myself in my bedroom again, double-checking that the Polaroid camera I'd received was next to me. Once more, I tried to remain awake, scanning the walls and ceiling for any movement. A few hours passed in tense silence. Then I heard a faint thud above my head, as though something shifted in the attic. I froze, unsure whether it was worth investigating. Gathering my courage, I unlocked my bedroom door and moved into the hallway. The attic hatch overhead looked the same as before, closed firmly, but a subtle draft seemed to drift down from the edges, carrying that same chemical tang of developing film. I found a ladder, carefully unlatched the hatch, and aimed my phone's flashlight into the cramped space. Dust drifted through the beam of light. The attic was dim and cluttered with seasonal decorations and old trunks. I climbed up, heart pounding, scanning each corner. At first glance, it appeared empty. Then I saw a discarded Polaroid film box wedged behind a stack of chairs. It had no business being there. We never stored camera equipment in the attic. No footprints, no obvious nest or sign of a person living up there, but that box was proof I wasn't alone in the house. I descended, hands shaking, and shut the hatch with a firm click. The sense of being watched suffused the hallway. I retreated to the living room and spent the rest of the night in a chair near the front door, eyes on the windows, the camera in my lap. The silence lasted until morning, when pale light finally eased my dread. My parents returned 2 days later to find me exhausted. I showed them the Polaroids, the empty film box, and described the nightly clicks and chemical smells. They searched the attic again and found no further evidence. We contacted the police, but without any sign of forced entry or physical harm, there was little they could do. The entire incident remained a mystery. I continued living in that house for another year, always uneasy at night. Sometimes, I would wake to the faint impression that someone had just left the hallway, or I would discover curtains drawn aside when I knew I had left them closed. But no more photographs arrived, and no one was ever seen. Even after all these years, the memory of that steady shutter click at midnight lingers. The enigma of who or what trespassed inside my home, taking pictures while I slept, remains unsolved. The Polaroid camera still sits in a box, unused since that incident. I can't bring myself to throw it away, even though I know it connects me to a moment of paralyzing dread. The realization that someone can invade your most familiar spaces, unseen, leaving only cryptic evidence behind, is a fear that never truly fades. Late at night, when I pass that spot on the living room couch, I sometimes recall the flash of light and the snap of a lens capturing me without my knowledge. It is a reminder that what truly terrifies us is not always what we see, but what we sense lurking just beyond our sight, content to watch us from the shadows until the moment it chooses to be known.